Welcome to our session, a maturity model for quote to cash. At MGA Research, we often get the question, which companies do monetization best? Who are the public examples of a world-class prospect to disclosure or quote to cash process? And we remind folks that monetization is a capability. It's comprised of process, people, and tools that all together help a company turn demand into revenue. And so the short answer to the question, which is a serious question, is that no single company does everything right. Some organizations are world-class at architecture. Some have extremely granular billing. Some do fantastic at frictionless quoting or providing frictionless commerce on a global scale. What's important to recognize is that monetization overall is a journey, and each company needs to look at where it can obtain the biggest impact the most quickly with the least amount of risk to the business. And to discuss this journey, I'm joined by Eric Carrasquilla, the Senior Vice President of Products at Conga. Welcome, Eric, and thanks for joining us here at the Monetize Forum.
Thanks, Andrew. Glad to be here.
So let's jump right into it here. Aptus, you're now Conga, but Aptus was one of the first companies to bring to the forefront this notion of quote to cash. And today, as the newly formed Conga, your vision has evolved to encompass the notion of what you call commercial operations transformation, with a focus on legal, revenue, and business ops. So what drove this shift in your thinking about quote to cash? And how did the merger of Aptus and Conga kind of shape your thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we got into a discussion as a leadership team around what winning was for our customers. And quote to cash didn't quite necessarily ring on what a win was. So what we came up with was this idea of peak commercial performance for every possible tomorrow. And what that broke down to was two key things. The first piece around peak commercial performance, the win there is around sustained profitable growth. And the concept of every possible tomorrow is helping customers navigate through hurdles that they run into as they grow from where they're at to that sustained profitable growth. And if that's the definition of winning for companies, we saw where quote to cash in and of itself fell a little bit short. The first piece is that just looking at quote to cash, it assumes everything starts with a quote in a linear flow. And as you really dig in across industries, this isn't necessarily the case. In some cases, it might start with an agreement. In some cases, there might not be a quote at all. So this was one piece that we looked at. The second thing that we looked at was around the teams involved with this. And so quote to cash, I think in our initial thinking around this, it was predominantly the sales teams. And as we started unpacking that a bit, there's a lot more functions that are involved on the legal operations side and the business operations side of things that are in support of those sales teams, and they need to work together in order to transform. And then the last piece that we looked at is that for a lot of these companies, they don't flip a switch and this happens overnight. They transform over time and move up in capabilities up the maturity curve. So with that in mind and that view of what winning was for our customers, we looked at this and says, hey, this isn't quote to cash. This is more of a transformation of their commercial operations to help them get to peak commercial performance.
Yeah, completely agree. And for most organizations, as you're describing, improving their monetization capabilities or their performance, it's really a multi-year endeavor comprised of multiple projects that often include fully digitizing contract management, rationalizing SKUs, implementing a disciplined governance model for managing prices, products, offers, and more. So you guys, Conga, recently introduced a maturity model to help organizations assess themselves and then figure out what the right measures were to take as kind of part of this, monetization endeavor. What led your thinking to kind of building that model and kind of what went into the creation of it?
Yeah, so this kind of relates to the prior question about not being able to flip a switch. And there's very few companies that are doing this great across the board. So we spent a lot of time within our customer base, and the combined company has 10,000 plus customers across multiple different industries and across multiple stages of where they are from a growth perspective. And that helped us get a very good view on what good was versus great, and different patterns among customers of the sequence in which they would solve problems and the benefit they would get around that. And a lot of that is iteration and going through and working with customers as well. So that idea of being able to look through and help customers get incremental wins and to be able to show them what other best-in-class companies are doing helps provide them a much more measured approach and more of a menu that they can choose from versus a one-size-fits-all kind of approach.
What have been, I know it's still early days in terms of your introduction of the model, but what have been some of the kind of outlier surprises, the early surprises, the unexpected benefits that you've seen so far?
So the thing that surprises me is you would think the larger companies are doing this better and the smaller companies are doing it not as well. One of the surprising pieces is that some of the best examples we've found are from the smaller companies that have done this transformation. And some of the bigger companies are at the lower end of the maturity curve. There's a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing company that we spent some time with that is still doing quoting based on Excel. And the biggest win for them within the short term relates to cycle time and approvals, and the kind of benefits that they can get from cutting that in half and how that relates to preventing revenue leakage. And just a very elemental thing that you'd think, hey, this is something that was solved long ago. Who's still doing quoting by Excel, especially a larger multi-billion-dollar company with significant financial resources? But those things still persist out there. And from a benefit perspective, that's something where we can go in very quickly within 90 days. And not just cut cycle time in half. In this particular case, it was over 80% that we were able to bring it down and help the folks within the team have a much more data-driven discussion with their sales organization related to, hey, where are we discounting and why, and what's the financial impact of that?
Yeah, I think in our experience, the benefit of those models, and we're big believers in kind of structured approaches and structured maturity models, is that it helps facilitate, like you said, a data-driven conversation, and it takes it out of kind of a very narrow view and puts the conversation into a broader context that the whole organization can understand and kind of get behind. One of the things, and this kind of fits with that, is that the pandemic has really exposed where companies have manual gaps in their processes. And we saw last year during the height of the pandemic that it was really impossible to hide the areas that were either unautomated or semi-automated. You and I worked at one of the largest enterprise applications companies back in the 1990s. You've been working in this space for decades. What do you think has been holding companies back? Put the pandemic to the side, but what's been holding companies back in terms of being able to more fully automate all of their processes?
So I think it's a few things. I don't think it's one universal reason. Some of the things that I've seen, when the business process that they're looking to go through and automate, if it hops an organizational silo, if it's something that goes between sales and finance, or finance and legal and operations, that's a tricky thing because it requires folks to speak to each other. And in larger organizations, that doesn't happen as much across organizational boundaries. I think the second thing is the inability with a purpose-built application to deal with amplified complexity. And we see this a lot on the CPQ side of things, where they'll go through and they'll put a system in, but when you start adding things like, hey, we're going from perpetual to subscription, or we are doing bundling with physical and digital goods and services. We're not just dealing with hundreds of users, we're dealing with thousands of users. That's where you start to see the stress fractures around components. And then the last piece is just the changes in technology and the underlying platform that then, if the applications have not been built and deployed in a componentized way, it requires these sweeping changes that are very difficult for folks to go through and do. So they're all solvable problems, but those are the three reasons why I think it's been holding companies back over time.
So one of the ways that organizations historically have tried to make major changes in the business and the business processes is by bringing in, it's the big IT project built around a core, a quote unquote core system. And that becomes the rallying cry to help drive organizational change across departments, for example. Do you think it's more important for the organizations to orient first around a platform and then look at applications? Should the business application be independent of the platform? Should I be looking at individual point solutions? Should I look at who's got the broadest, most breadth of capability? How do you think about that? And what do you recommend for people?
Yeah, so I think the first piece is to be very, very clear on what problems you're looking to solve and what the sequence is of how you're going to go through and solve those. I see a lot of companies start with technology first before that point, and they kind of build and paint themselves into a corner. So that's the first piece, and that kind of links to what we were talking before about maturity model being one of those tools. Hey, what do we want to be when we grow up, and what trade-offs are we willing to take in order to get there? The second piece is to avoid the what I would call the California fire problem. So for those not familiar with this, we've had a series of wildfires in California over the last few years. And one of the byproducts of that is these giant rolling blackouts for huge geographical areas. Even though the fire only threatened a component of the grid, because it wasn't componentized, everything had to come down around it. So as you're going through and putting in technology to solve those particular problems, the more that you can do it in a modularized way that does not require these sweeping technological changes, sweeping upgrades, and bringing everything down in order to make a change in one part of the business, that's definitely what you want to go through and aim towards. And then the third piece, it's the focus on the applications at hand. So of course you don't want a patchwork of 90 different vendors of what you're going through and doing. The more you can go through and consolidate, the better. But there needs to be a good balance between that modularity and being able to get the kind of economies of scale around the platform for a vendor. But the summary thing that I'd say is really start with that problem you want to solve first, because that's going to drive a lot of whether or not you go best of breed or everything under the sun from one vendor.
Yeah, certainly there's been over the last couple of years in technology, whole conversation around microservices and the componentization of applications. Where do you see the new opportunities for innovation, particularly in process automation around workflow, which really gets to the heart of automating some of these areas of the business that previously were unautomated or kind of semi-automated?
Yeah, one of the I think there's a couple areas that are really exciting. The first one is around the general concept of what some folks call process mining. So one of the fortunate byproducts of the digitization of all these business processes is that there's now a critical mass of these digital breadcrumbs from different parts of the organization that you can go back through and really understand in an end-to-end flow where the bottlenecks are. and what you can do in order to remove those by material amounts. And this is something that's at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and requires going through and having this stuff digitized first and solving the manual problem that you talked about before. But we're seeing, a lot of great insight there, particularly around the cycle time area. The second piece that I'd say is around this concept of one click. Whether it's related to ordering or whether it's related to an agreement or quote or how you go through and price things, but it's being able to take advantage of these digital breadcrumbs as well and kind of the implicit needs analysis versus just the explicit one, and be able to come up with recommendations within 90% accuracy at different moments of truth along that chain. Again, what's the best price plan for a customer? What's the quote that's going to have the best hit rate? What are clauses that are going to have the highest probability of being accepted with the lowest risks? So a lot of that is data centric and around mining and recommendation stuff that we're really excited about.
Cool. One click. I like it. We are almost out of time, but give me one thing that every CXO should know about Conga but doesn't.
I think most CXOs might be familiar with Conga as a document generation company or Aptus as a quote to cash company. But with the two together, probably the thing that every CXO should know is that as far as commercial operations transformation, what we talked about earlier and helping them win with sustained profitable growth, that we're a leader in the space. We have 10,000 plus customers, tons of great outcomes for companies, whether they're getting at the starting point of that journey or they've hit the top of that hierarchy of needs. Something that we're a leader and we can help them win.
Cool. Well, Eric, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us here. And I'd remind everyone that there's more information, I'm sure, at the Conga booth. I'm sure you'll be around for the networking and happy to answer any questions. So again, thanks for joining us today and enjoy the rest of Monetize Forum. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.